G'day and welcome to the Reputation Revolution show. My name is Trevor Young and I'm really excited to bring you today's episode featuring Joanna Penn. She's a New York Times and USA Today best-selling fiction author, a nonfiction author, a long-time podcaster, and someone who I think embodies everything we talk about here on the show. And when I say everything, I mean everything. For 14 years, Joanna has blazed a trail, not just in the world of independent publishing, but also in the way she's built her personal brand on a global basis. That she's managed to continually evolve both professionally and creatively is testament to her mindset and her attitude, her commitment to lifelong learning, and her willingness to experiment in public and share the lessons along the way. I think Joanna is a genuine, credible authority in her field. She's both a domain expert and a bona fide thought leader. She has built a loyal global audience via her podcast and her YouTube channel. She's active on social media and she's in demand as a public speaker. Her story is an inspirational one. Let's hear it now. Joanna, welcome to the show. Terrific to have you on. I think you're one of my very early guests many, many moons back, and a lot's happened since then. So looking forward to our conversation.
Oh, thanks for having me, Trevor. And yeah, we've, I guess, known each other in the internet sense for more than a decade now. So yeah, it's exciting to catch up.
I know, and in digital dog years, we've known each other for about 70 years. So, indeed. As I said in the intro, there's going to be a lot to unpack. You've done some amazing stuff. I've followed you for a very long time. Bought your courses, I bought your books, I listened to your podcast. I feel like I know you pretty well, but for those people who listeners who haven't, not sure of who you are and what you do, can you give us a thumbnail sketch, and then we'll unpack a lot of it anyway. What you're doing currently and sort of your quick journey.
Sure. Well, I guess I'm an author and a podcaster. I write nonfiction for authors and self-help, and I also write thrillers, dark fantasy, and crime as JF Penn. And I'm also a speaker, and I do some other things. I have Patreon and all this. I'm sure we'll talk about multiple streams of income. But I guess I'm trying to redefine myself in terms of the value I bring as opposed to what I actually do, which we might get into, but it's more important in the era of AI, not exactly the tools we use, but perhaps the value we bring. So I help people. Basically, I help authors create their books and a living, and I help readers escape into a world of adventure. So that's kind of how I'm thinking. That in itself might be useful for people, because as the tools change, our value is the thing that we bring that's important.
100%. And you call yourself an authorpreneur. So basically, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you're basically building a personal brand-based enterprise around your author brands. And so you can build a sustainable living from your writing.
Yeah, although I still prefer it as two words, author-entrepreneur. But yes, I guess you can be an author in the more traditional sense. And in fact, when we first met, I was in Australia and I wrote my first book back in 2007 and looked at the traditional industry, publishing industry, looked at getting an agent and all of that. And as a businesswoman, I just could not see how I could leave my job and become an author making six figures, multi-six figures in that way. So I went down the self-publishing route. Now we really call it being an indie author, being an independent author. And that was the basis of being more of an entrepreneur, because to run a business as an author, you also have to have the artist hat on, and then you have to have the publisher hat, and then you have to have the marketing, and then you have to do all the back end, as you know, the back end of a business, accounting setup and all of that kind of thing. So I think you have to have more of an attitude of an entrepreneurial attitude, go out there and do it and get it done yourself if you want to, I think, make a sustainable living as an author in these days. You can absolutely get a publishing deal if you want and go that way, but then it's really out of your control. The publisher chooses when to pay you, they choose where to sell your book and all of that, and you really don't have control. I have control of my books. I do licensing deals, but essentially, yeah, as you say, I'm an author entrepreneur running a multi-six-figure business as a single person company.
And there's you kind of alluded to it, but we'll just break it open just that little bit more. There's two sides to it. You've got kind of two sides. One is the the author, so JF Penn. So you're actually writing. How many books have you fiction
Nearly
books have you
40.
written?
Oh, fiction, 19.
19. And then there's the non-fiction Joanna Penn, aka the Creative Penn. Always loved that name. And Penn. And with that, you write non-fiction, helping, as we mentioned, helping people become indie authors and build a business around their writing. But other people, you don't. It's around living a creative life, I guess, and making money from your creative efforts. But in terms of that, you've got the podcast. You've been blogging for X amount of years.
Well, it's interesting. I haven't blogged in the traditional sense for probably 5 years
Yep.
now.
Yep.
Again, when we met, blogging, writing the articles according to serving an audience was the thing. And then over the years, about probably 4 or 5 years ago, I recognized that in the space that I'm in the niche I'm in, self-publishing for my main site, the Creative Penn, as you mentioned, there were other brands that were coming up that were offering better how-to information, better practical information. The Alliance of Independent Authors, for example, has the self-publishingadvice.org, sites like Kindlepreneur, Dave Chesson's site. And I looked at them at that time. And again, this might help people in terms of where you put your energy. And I was like, do you know what? There's no point in me writing how-to information or blogs anymore, and so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to focus on my podcast, but my podcast being like usually an hour long most weeks with quite a long introduction. What I can bring that other people can't bring is my own spin on whatever's happening. And as you listen to my show, I do like an extensive introduction sometimes about what's happening in the industry. And a lot of people come back for that, not just the interviews, and they want to know you, the host, like they will, like the listeners of this show want Trevor, and I'm just popping in. So that's the thing. And so I stopped really blogging about 4 or 5 years ago. I occasionally will do a post, like I just did one on the tools I use in my business. It's essentially like an old school listicle post full of affiliate links. So it's a good, business post, because I was speaking on that at London Book Fair and I wanted to have somewhere people could find a list. But my show notes of my podcast are essentially the text on my blog now, and there are tens of millions of words on my site. So it's funny, I do almost feel like we've moved past the era of what we called blogging back when you and I met in that, I guess, mid early 2000s.
Yeah, and I guess the blog today is really a content hub, so you can put everything there. If you want to drop in an article, you can. You
or
can put
video.
your newsletters in there, whack videos in there, and obviously you're putting your podcast show notes as well. So to me, when I say think blog, I think sort of a content hub, but you've still got a blog on your website, and it just contains a lot of your show notes. And as you say, that listicle was you popped up just the other day, and a lot of good value in that. But a lot of your teaching, of course, is in your non-fiction books. But the key here is that you have built your brand, your personal brand, as this person who can really help aspiring independent authors. And by the way, you're also in the trenches doing it. So I've looked at you. I've sort of gone through this period where a lot of the people I work with, most of the people I work with are sort of veer more towards thought leaders. And then you get people who are just straight experts who have got very, very, very deep expertise, and they kind of stay in their lane a lot, and, they become expert in that. But the thought leaders are the ones that kind of build audiences and all of that. And you are a complete hybrid. You are categorically, I hold you up when I'm teaching this little bit as a hybrid, because you are a deep, deep expertise, but you have got this thought leadership side to you. And in terms of thought leadership in the publishing game, I've always said you're my go-to for anything to do with publishing, independent of publishing or not. And more recently, in the last few years, you've been early out of the gates in terms of the whole AI, Web3, NFTs. Can you just walk us through how up to date are you on that? You seem to be all up to date. And then, of course, that gets you onto other podcasts and conferences and stuff like that. Where does the AI futurism in publishing sit with you?
Yeah, so I would recommend the Clifton Strengths to people. I did this test a few years ago now, and two of my strengths are futuristic and strategy. And that just made so much sense to me. I also have learner, intellection, and input. And so essentially, that's, I guess, why I love what I do. I don't know what comes first, loving what you do and then the strengths test, or the other way around. But it just made sense to me and enabled me, because I was resisting this. I was like, why do I always feel the need to be pushing forwards into new technologies and thinking about the impact? Because frankly, my audience, I've had to drag kicking and screaming, and have lost people over time because they're like, I don't want to talk about this. Why do you want to talk about this? We're artists. Why do we need to know about this stuff? But I just, yeah, I eat this stuff for breakfast. Literally, we're recording in my morning, and I always check my AI feed on Twitter. I've got a curated list, and I want to see what's happening. I love to see what the tools coming out, what's going on, and how that might affect the industry. So not everybody needs to do that. Like in the author niche, for example, even though I do have books on like how to write nonfiction, how to write a novel, I do craft things. That is one side, and the other side is this business head. But I think in terms of how people should look at it is, are you excited by what you're doing? I mean, I almost gave this up. I haven't talked about this too much, but last year, sort of August 2022, I was really bored. I was bored with the industry, and I was like, really, is this it? Am I just going to keep writing books over and over again? I mean, I love writing books, but is that it? What's happening? Why is this industry so stagnant? And I first self-published 15 years ago, and I was like, why isn't this changed? And then and I even looked at going back to university, doing a master's in applied AI and moving into industry again, back into consulting. And then ChatGPT launched in November, and I was off to the races. So I could suddenly see how all the things that had been flying around large language models were going to impact writers and publishing. And it hasn't gone out as we record this, but maybe as the show goes out, I've got an episode coming on the AI-assisted artisan author. And this will kind of be my stake in the ground for the next step of my iteration as both a crafts person and as a business person. So I think coming back to the listeners and yourself, when you're considering some of where to move next, I find it's about energy. So I just love learning about this stuff. So it energizes me. Yes, it's a little bit scary, but equally, I just get up every day and I want to know what's happening. So whatever that is in your industry, whatever you're interested, whatever you're reading as fun, not just for work. And I think that's one of the hallmarks of a personal brand business is this is fun, not just work. Compared to when I was an SAP consultant working in the mining industry in Australia, I was not reading anything about that industry. I wasn't reading about mining, and I was not reading about SAP as a software package or anything like that. So I just wasn't interested. But now it's what I do all the time. So follow your passions and your interests, and then try and weave that back into your work, because your audience will pick up on that energy.
Yeah, and I think we get hit so many times with you got a niche, and then super niche down. And I think when it comes to building presence and profile and growing your sphere of influence, you don't need to be super niche. You need to be directed, but you need to give yourself permission to go and explore different things, because that's what's going to make you more unique. If you're niche and someone else has got that niche, you're just going head to head. The marketing side and the taglines and all that might be niche, but as a general rule of building your personal brand and your professional bona fides, I think that, being able to explore other things and as long as you can kind of bring them back. I mean, I wouldn't name names, but we all know people in this space who grew big profiles and, from blogging and on social media, and then they just confuse the market completely, and I have absolutely no idea what they stand for and who they are and what they do anymore. So that's the challenge. But of course, as you've said, you've had to face that challenge by, you've evolved. What you're doing now is completely different, not completely different, but very different for what you're doing 5 years ago, which was different to what you're doing 5 years previous. Do you sit down and work through that? I know you're a plan, you plan at the start of the year, you have podcasts talking about your goals and that sort of stuff. How much scope do you do, or how much effort do you put in that side of it, the planning?
I just want to come back on what you said about what I'm doing is different to 5 years ago and 5 years before that, because even though the industry has evolved and the tools and technologies and things have evolved, at heart, I still do the same thing. I started my podcast in 2009. So I'm like an old school podcaster at this point. And I still use Twitter. I actually think maybe we met on Twitter. It's one of those things, like I'm still on there until it spirals the drain and is gone. I'm there till it dies. I've still got a YouTube channel. I started my YouTube in 2008. I mean, I haven't jumped on TikTok. I haven't jumped on a lot of the new things that have come along. So in one way, I still do email every 2 weeks. I email my list, that kind of thing. So there are some things that stayed the same. What changed it? And the other thing that stayed the same is who I serve in terms of my audience. So that has stayed the same. Then in terms of planning for the year, you can't necessarily see this right now, but behind me there's a poster and it says, measure your life by what you create. And that's kind of how I look at every year, is what can I create this year for my audiences. So for my fiction and for my nonfiction, what books am I going to create? Because I do measure my life by my books. And then my podcast is another part of my body of work. And are there any potential themes that are going to come up, or what do I want to focus on in that way? And then I also do talk about health and travel and all of that kind of stuff as well, as it relates to my business. But it's funny, I have a kind of hybrid approach again to this, which is I might plan something and then it goes completely out the window. For example, my first book was called How to Enjoy Your Job or Find a New One, which again was my first book in Australia. And I wrote that in 2007. And then I left my job in 2011 to go full time. And in 2012, I rewrote that as Career Change. So it's out there right now as a book called Career Change. And then I just went to London Book Fair and met with an agent, and she said, oh, we could really license this around the world, but we need a new edition. And at the same time, with all the changes in AI, I've really felt that the job of being an author is changing. The job of being a writer, the word writer, is going to be changing to something like creative director. So I was like, do you know what? This is actually a really good time to rewrite Career Change as a third edition. And so I've completely, I did not intend to rewrite Career Change this year. And now I feel like this is the perfect time to rewrite that book. So we're recording this in April. It'll probably be out like July-ish, 2023. And then I'll be also working on another novel and all of this. So I have plans, but I hold them quite lightly, and then I adapt to what comes along. But in the meantime, every week I have my podcast, and I get money from Patreon, I get money from advertisers, I get money from my backlists, all of that kind of thing. So I can switch it up and change direction because I have that sort of evergreen income.
Okay. I like that you say you plan lightly, but then that opens. I haven't heard that phrase before, but I really like that. It's sort of it's a direction, and you got your purpose and direction, and you basically know where you're going, but you're nimble enough because you run your own show. You can swap things out and change things up. And as you say, the other thing when I was saying that you're doing things differently is that you have pushed into the futurism, the AI, but you have done stuff on travel. You've done a travel podcast. You've done some really interesting different things that are kind of, I guess, adjacent to your personal brand, and will probably pick up some of your audience and maybe some new audience as well. So you haven't stopped, and that's probably why you're still creatively flourishing, because you're experimenting all the time and you're trying new things, which keeps things fresh. We need to keep things fresh. How many episodes of the podcast now? You're up to 600 and something?
680, I think. Yeah, it's kind of crazy. And again, sometimes I feel like, oh, am I going to give this up? Am I done? Have I got nothing left to say? And then something shifts. I'm doing a ton of content right now on the AI for creatives space. And again, some people listen, some people don't. And I try and intersperse that with things like how to write good characters, which is an evergreen topic, or how to edit your book, which again is evergreen. But yes, I feel like, and here's another tip for podcasters. Obviously, you know this, but if people come back, what will give people a reason to come back every single week? And if you want to do advertising revenue, you need consistent listenership and downloads. And so this isn't why I did it, is that someone emailed me after about 5 years of my podcast and said, could you maybe talk a bit about what you're up to in terms of your writing journey in an introduction? And I was like, why would anyone want to hear from me? I do an interview show. They'll just want to hear from my interviewees about what they do. And then I started the introduction. And as I said before, it's become a really important part of my show. And a lot of people do just come back to listen to the introduction and sometimes listen to the interview. So I think that's another tip for people. If you're starting a podcast or if you're doing any kind of interview format show, make sure there's enough of you, the creator, in it, so that people come back. And also because I do news is a difficult one because it's not evergreen, but people will still go back and listen to the backlist. And news to me, because I'm so addicted, is for many people, they don't necessarily know about these things until a lot later. But yeah, people will come back for a regular slot by the host.
Yeah, and I do recommend your podcast, The Creative Penn, because of those. You actually put on a show. I often talk about a show, a destination show, and something that, you know, if you look at the shows on TV or whatever, they got that you're familiar with them. There's got that format, and I think you're right. What you've got that, you know, a big company can't do is it's got you, and it's, you know, it's you're relatable, and the podcast makes you even more relatable, and people reach out to you on Twitter as a result, and, you know, tell you where they're watching when they're listening to the show, and take photos and all of that sort of stuff. So that relatability and familiarization, I think, is incredibly important. And so how many? Let's get onto the channel. So I'll just go back one step in terms of the mindset and positioning. So, you know, you've got a handle on stuff. You're a light planner, but you can move. You're happy to evolve. You're bringing your audience along. You've always brought your audience along. But a lot of that is mindset as well, isn't it? A willingness to learn, a willingness to do that. And I think that, you know, that side of planning is really important on a personal brand-based business, for example, but don't let planning get in the way of getting it done. You know, still got to take action. And how many books did you say? So you've written 40 books completely.
Nearly. Well, it's funny. I multiple editions of the same thing sometimes, like my How to Make a Living with Your Writing, that's on the 3rd edition, and How to Market a Book is 3rd. You know, the problem with writing nonfiction is that things change. And so you have to potentially do other editions if you want to stay current. But you mentioned learning there, and I think this is something that's absolutely critical. So just to be clear to people listening, I have a degree in theology. So, and I mean, it turns up in my fiction, but it's not a particularly useful degree. But I have learned, so I don't have any, you know, professional writing skills other than writing and learning and doing and working with editors and things like that. I don't have any marketing background. I don't have potentially a publishing background, but I've learned all of this along the way. And as things have changed, you have to learn new things. So I'm relearning, I guess, learning from scratch, how to write or create with these AI tools. So, you know, I love Midjourney. I'm sure you're on Midjourney too. You know, it's really fun with images. I'm writing with GPT-4 and all of this kind of thing. And it's like, I'm learning in a different way how to create what's in my head. And over the years, we've had to learn new things. Like you and I mean, you're not born knowing how to podcast. And in fact, I still have my original videos on YouTube. My first videos on YouTube, it's just so funny to watch me. And you talk about being sort of relatable and all of this. But when I look at those early videos, I did just not have a clue what I was doing. And it's so funny to watch myself in a house in Ipswich near Brisbane. It's where we were living at the time. And it's kind of this, I did a book review of Jack Canfield's The Success Principles, which I really love. I still recommend. Fantastic book. And it's just so funny. But I leave those up there because it's important to recognize how far we've come. And we can't be at this stage of the journey. I couldn't be a 15-year-in entrepreneur unless I'd actually started back in 2008. And again, on the podcasting, the first one, I was again in Australia, I phoned up this person on a phone back when we all had phones. And I held a recording device next to the phone on speakerphone, and I mean the quality is terrible. But again, I've left it there. You might remember it was the 3 Ingredients by Rachel Birmingham. The
Oh,
Three
yes,
Ingredients. You remember the cookbook?
A cookbook and massive success and a very low production, lo-fi production.
Quality. Oh my goodness. The quality was appalling, but it became this huge bestseller in Australia. And these women were making loads of money from this book. And that was my first interview. And so you just have to get started, you just have to get going. And then over time, Skype came along, and then now Zoom and what we're on, Riverside, whatever, there's all these tools. And so you just learn the next step. And let's be clear, there is overwhelm and there is overload. So I say to people, what you must do is only learn the next step. So in the publishing industry, it's crazy. I'll get people coming up to me saying, I'm writing my first book and I need to know about Facebook marketing. And I'm like, no, you don't. You do not need to know about this now. It's going to have changed by the time you're ready. So focus on finishing the book. So if you're writing your first draft, the next thing you need to learn is editing. And there's a lot to learn there, and structure and all of that kind of thing, and the craft side. And once you have a book or 2 or 3, then it might be time to really get into hardcore book marketing. But don't jump ahead to the future when you just need to learn what you need to learn now.
Yeah, terrific advice there. So all of that is kind of the mindset and the willingness to embrace. And that's when the magic happens. And build in public. That's the other thing. You're always building in public. You're always saying lessons learned. You take people's, whether you've had a good year, you review the previous year. So whether you've had a good year or not. And it's this, I guess, degree of vulnerability that, over time you probably get more comfortable with.
Yeah.
But everything's scary at some point. But this building in public is really one of these strands of this, that makes you relatable as a content creator. So let's look at your, I guess, platform that's used in publishing and also in marketing, in terms of the channels you've got. And I like that you've pretty much stayed on the main one. So Twitter is the big one for you, YouTube, although I don't think you put your podcast videos up anymore.
Oh, here's a tip. So I don't do video a couple of years ago, I just decided not to go video, but I do occasional videos, but mostly I'm audio only. And then I don't know if you saw this, but only a couple of weeks ago now, YouTube finally, after 20 years, launched podcasting. So now you can just go in and assign a playlist to the podcast on YouTube, and you now have an actual dedicated audio podcast feed. So I went to Podcast Movement in the US, and I had stopped putting the podcast on YouTube because it wasn't video. And then I heard over there an Indian guy say the biggest channel for podcast listening in India is YouTube, and for audio only. And I was like, okay, so I've been audio only on YouTube for years now, and it's a great channel. I've got over 50,000 listeners. So that's another tip for people. Don't assume that you have to just put video on YouTube. It can be audio only, and then I'll occasionally do a tutorial or something like that, but it's mostly an audio channel. So again, the amount of time it takes for me to edit and do video properly is too much, and I don't really like live video like we're doing it now, but I don't really like it. But it's funny we say this right now, but I need to change my attitude, because in an era of deep fakes, and you can deep fake a video too, but I need to be more a person, like a real person. So I'm going to try and do more video. So that is something I'm shifting back into after several years of not doing it. So we switch it up. But I have had a YouTube channel, Twitter. With podcasting, I've been with Blueberry since the beginning. So BLUBRRY.com, and Blueberry are old school, and they distribute to everywhere. So every time something new's come along, I've appeared there. They're also a great channel for advertising. If you want to monetize a podcast, their advertising numbers are trusted. There's only a few platforms where those numbers are trusted. So, or they measure the right thing. So, and then I guess I have my website, the Creative Penn, and I actually have loads of websites. I have jfpenn.com. I have a Shopify store now, creativepennbooks.com. And what else do I have? I have booksandtravel.page, which is and what's interesting, you mentioned it before, but I was pretty bored a few years ago again, and I thought I'm going to start this travel brand. This was 2019, and then the pandemic hit, and so I carried it on, but I've now kind of put it on hold. But what it did was help me write this book, which is Pilgrimage, which is my memoir, which came out on Kickstarter. I did a Kickstarter earlier this year. It's available everywhere now. But Pilgrimage, I really needed that Books and Travel podcast to kind of help me figure out what the hell I was writing. And the period of writing it really did match the period of writing that book and walking the Camino and all of that kind of thing. So I guess this is another way of saying for people, you can start things and then they can stop.
Yes.
In order to do a certain project. But my website, The Creative Penn, has continued since 2008. Although, again, I'll point out I had 2 websites before that failed. So often, or didn't fail, I just turned them off because they weren't the niche I wanted to get into. So that would be another tip for people. Ideally, come up with a name for your podcast where you can grow into it over time, as opposed to something that, well, my first website was called howtoenjoyyourjob.com, and it was my first book, which, again, don't do that. Don't create a website around your first book if you're going to write more. So yeah, lots of tips there.
So the Creative Penn is your business, but which came first? Was it the podcast or the business? How does where did the name come from in that regard?
Well, I set up it all came together. I mean, I set up the website and a company. Well, I was a freelancer at the time, so it kind of came under my company anyway. But I realized Yarrow Starak, Yarrow, Australian, Canadian, Ukrainian. I was one of his students, and he would often talk about having this personal brand. And so I wanted Penn, that is actually my name with a double N, as part of being a writer. And the Creative Penn seemed like a brand that I could potentially go in different directions with. I could now. I mean, I could become a sculptor and it would still work.
Indeed, yes, you're lucky on that front, because it it doesn't really matter what you're doing; everything fits under it beautifully. So, so the podcast is your main driver. What sort of? I mean, you described the other. I must have read it somewhere. The amount of downloads you get, or the immediate downloads, or the top percentage in the world, or whatever. Where's it sitting now? Just to give people a bit of context on how big this podcast has become.
Yeah, so it's around nearly 8.5 million downloads across 228 countries, and each episode gets between sort of 12 and 25,000 downloads. And the impactful plays thing is really useful for advertising, if people don't know. So 86% impactful plays, which means people listen to at least 75% of the show.
Yep.
And I am only getting technical with you because people listening might find that interesting for advertising revenue purposes, because of course if you have a mid-roll ad, then you want people to listen to at least 75% of the show. Otherwise, advertisers aren't going to be so happy. By the way, I only work with advertisers who I actually work with personally. Yes. So I have personal relationships. I don't use auto ads on Spotify or any of the platforms. It's all personally done through my relationships. And yeah, I mean, in terms of downloads, there's some stats, it's on my website, but it is in the top 1% of podcasts in terms of listens and also revenue. So we both know most podcasts cost money, because you're potentially paying for hosting, certainly costing your time to do it. And so back in 2015, so I started the podcast in 2009 with the aim of just making some friends and networking in the author community. And then around 2014, 2015, I was like, I have to make some money from this, or, it's taking a lot of time. And so I started my Patreon, and then I got advertisers. And of course, I always have shared it's like book marketing, but also I share affiliate links, I share webinars, I share courses and all of that kind of thing. So all of those things relate to the podcast revenue, but it is like its own business in terms of the income.
Yeah. And it's a bona fide media channel. So
Yeah, for sure.
it's a show. It really, again, I recommend people have a listen to it and how you set it up, and then you have the interview and how you, as you say, some are pushing ahead into the future and challenging for the audience, and other things are more evergreen around topics that people are who are aspiring authors or authors are going to need. So it's, as you say, you serve an audience, you understand that audience. Sometimes a lot of the time you're giving them, and your books and everything are for that audience, and other times you're bringing the audience along kicking and screaming, and that's that thought leadership part of you. In terms of I guess I know that you do a lot of conferences. You get invited to them. You probably don't go to every one of them and stuff like that. But because you've built your personal brand, you've built this thought leadership positioning in the marketplace. How what's the speaking side of things for you now? You're sort of doing a lot more, doing less. What does that side look like? And do you sort of get asked to be newspapers, podcasts, TV, the earned media side? How does that shake out?
Yeah, I mean, I get asked to speak a lot. It's unfortunate that the niche I'm in is not a highly paid speaker niche. So here's another tip for people. If you would like to be a highly paid speaker, don't speak to authors, especially fiction authors. Definitely pick where you can speak to businesses. Like I know people who can earn like 20 grand, 50 grand speaking at a conference for business. So that would be a tip for people. So I do get asked to speak quite a lot, but because I find I'm an introvert, and often it's in America, and traveling is tiring, and jet lag is tiring, and speaking is tiring. So I try not to do too much. My main criteria are, is it a conference I want to attend anyway for either what's going on or the people, or is it somewhere I would like to travel to? So, for example, last week I spoke in Seville in Spain. I've been before, but a chance to go to Seville in April to speak, it was a good thing. So, and I was asked to speak in Amsterdam, but Amsterdam in April is freezing. So I was like, I think I'll go to Seville. So that you have to have some criteria. I mean, as your profile gets bigger, it's a terrible word, but people find you and you get asked to do things, and we spend the early years saying yes to everything, and then as the years progress we say no to most things, and it's hard to say no, especially when your ego's involved. I find this very hard. People will say things and I'm like, oh yeah, of course I'll do that, and my ego's like, oh yeah, I really want to do that, and then later on I think, why am I doing this? I have a big platform with my podcast. How will this help? How will this take me any bigger than this? So you mentioned like TV and stuff. I would say that because of my niche, so self-publishing, independent authorship, building your own stuff is not necessarily what traditional media likes. So I don't tend to be involved with traditional media. I don't do PR. I know you in fact, the last PR I did was in Australia, and I got on national TV and in the national papers, but it didn't sell books. So I really focus on direct sales in terms of marketing. So I do Facebook Meta advertising. I do Amazon advertising for my books. That's mainly what I do. The podcast I've never advertised. It's grown really word of mouth. But yeah, and I guess I've done sort of passive SEO type thing and have my books available. All of it's content marketing, really. Content marketing is mainly what I focus on. So I would say most of what I have is, what do we call that, earned media. And then I have specific paid media for direct sales.
Yeah, and it is that combination. You've got your own channels, which is your email list, which is no doubt continuing to grow off the back of the podcast and everything else like that. The earned media comes from you either proactively seek stuff out. Some people do, and some people it just can come to them once you build a brand big enough. It comes to you, and then you've got to be strategic in what you do. But I'm a bit like you in the early days. You say a lot to a lot of things, and then over a period of time, you've got to make sure that there's a lot of energy to be taken, particularly if you're introvert in getting up and speaking, and often there's travel as well. And I guess the other part of it is, you've just touched on is the paid side, which is kind of like the more marketing. I look at it as brand and reputation keeps building on, 365 days of the year. Your podcast and all your own media channels are your assets. And then, for specific products, you can do marketing campaigns, but they all work off the back of your brand and reputation. So it's not just one thing anymore, unfortunately. If it was, a lot of people out there pitching, it's only one thing. If you do this formula, you will be...
that book, The One Thing, has a lot.
Drowning leads and sales. You won't even be able to keep up. Sure.
Also, we should say on that, I mean, I do have author friends who write very clear in a niche. We always use the example of Lee Child with Jack Reacher, right? He just wrote 21 books as just him, and now his brother's got it. But you can be very, very successful in one niche doing the same thing over and over again. But the question is, are you that type of person? And I'm like popcorn brain, and I cannot. I mean, if I try to do the same thing over and over again, I would just be so bored, and I might as well go get a day job. So yeah, I think you can do the one thing if you're that kind of person. But there's another book called Range. I can't remember who wrote that, but I always say Range is the book, which is go broad, and you will find your kind of niche in there. I'm sure you can put it in the show notes or whatever. But yeah, the book's called Range, and it's kind of the opposite to the one thing.
Yes. I read the one thing recently and gave me goosebumps. Not necessarily in a good way, but I understand. I get it, and you've got to do what works for you. And if you are too broad, you bring it back in. Sometimes people are niche and they get boring, and they get bored and they want to break out, and they struggle how to break and where to break out. And these are challenges. It's clarity, it's messaging. I think it's very easy to overcook and overthink, and often when again, thought leaders and some of the best nonfiction authors out there, they come up with new ideas all the time, and they're experimenting, and they're blogging and tweeting and putting that stuff out there, and then that eventually becomes the book, and then the keynote, and then so it's not one. If anyone thinks there's a cookie cutter for anything like that, it's just not on anymore. So that's a key message, and that's a drum I bang often. And in terms of you've got a lot of balls in the air and stuff. Actually, how much time do you spend writing? Do you write every day, like your books, whether it's nonfiction or fiction? How do you structure that? I'm very interested to know.
I'm more of a project writer, or I sometimes call a binge writer. I don't write books every day, but it will be per project. So like I have here on my desk the draft of, it's almost like a manifesto for this AI assisted artisan author approach. And I've been crafting, it is seriously 15 pages, which is a lot of writing, none of which is AI, by the way. It's all human writing. And I've been working on this for about a week now. It's been in my head for a few months as the changes are happening around generative AI and the changes so I've been thinking about this piece of writing for about 3 months, and then I've taken a week, and and then yesterday I did like 9 hours of I have a bit of a headache this morning, so it's like a bit over a binge of writing and a lot of work. But and I intend to record this once I finish. So in terms of preparation for a solo episode of my podcast, it can take many, many hours. And that's one of the reasons people support me on Patreon, because they can get the podcast for free. They don't need to support me. So I do a Q&A as part of my patrons, but mainly people support the show because they get value from the content. So in terms of how I write, it's like, this is a project I needed to do. Now, I was intending to start this rewrite of Career Change, but I was like, I have to get this straight, and my community needs this piece of thought leadership. This is the real thought leadership piece, to be honest. Not that I think of it that way, but now you've said it, I'm going to choose it. So I need to write this piece, then I need to record it, and then it will go out on the podcast feed. Then I will be able to focus on my next piece of writing. Right. So I do have a draft of a novel that I'm also writing. But what I tend to do is, and I did this when I had a day job, in the morning before going to work, and when I was in Brisbane, the daylight is, you can wake up early. So I would get up at 5, I would do some writing, creating new things in the morning. And then when I got home, I would do the marketing and the podcasting and all of that. And I did 5 years while I had a job of building this business. And now I do the same. So the morning is my creative time. And I'm only doing this interview with you because you're in Australia, but normally my morning time is kind of reserved for the creating new stuff in the world.
Yep.
And that's how I want to portray it to people. So whether I'm writing fiction or nonfiction or a solo episode or creating a course or whatever I'm doing, is creating new stuff in the world. That's kind of my creative time in the morning. And then the afternoon, I'll do interviews like this. Usually I'll do my email, I'll do my, coming up to month end, I'll do some whatever I need to do for my accountant, and I'll do all of that kind of thing. And then in the middle, I also do exercise. I think this is really important too, is you have to be healthy physically. One of the biggest problems with the whole working from home, having your own business and all of this is that we can work all the time. And I'll say I'm a workaholic for sure. I work a lot. I work a lot more hours now than I ever did in a day job. But also I focus on my health. I mean, that last memoir, Pilgrimage, is about walking, long distance walking. And I'm about, after this interview, to go lifting. So I lift weights with the trainer and try and essentially keep my body going so my brain can keep going too. And I think you and I, we're more mature now than when we met. I'm heading for 50 and it's like I need to be stronger and fitter in order to create more as I get older. So I think these are all really important.
Absolutely. Well, we'll finish on that very positive note, and that's how Joanna fits everything in and blocks the time out and looks at it. I love the separation in the morning of the creative stuff and what you want to put out in the world, and then your more day-to-day admin stuff and all the marketing stuff that goes on. That is very necessary in the business as well. That happens then. So, Joanna, terrific to talk. Fantastic to catch up after so long. And where's the best? I can tell people the best place probably to find you is thecreativepenn.com. Is that right?
Yes. And if you're listening to this, wherever you're listening, The Creative Penn podcast on your favorite app. And you can buy my books everywhere as Joanna Penn and JF Penn.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Joanna, and good luck with the lifting.
Thanks for having me, Trevor.
Okay.